The iron gate groans shut behind him. Marcus, a grain merchant from Anch, arrested 3 days ago for insulting a tax collector, stands barefoot on sawdust already dark with old blood. The morning sun hasn't yet cleared the arcade arches, so half the Hippodrome floor still lies in shadow. Cold. He can hear them above, 70,000 voices, a living ocean of sound that makes his ribcage vibrate. But it's not cheering yet. It's murmuring. Waiting. Then he smells it. Not animals. Chemicals. Sulfur and oil and something sharper. Pitch, maybe, or naphtha. A attendant in a leather apron approaches, carrying a long brush dripping with dark liquid. The man says nothing. Doesn't look Marcus in the eye. He begins painting Marcus's legs, his torso, his arms. The substance is cold, viscous, stinking. Marcus tries to ask what's happening, but his throat has closed. The attendant steps back. Wipes his hands. Walks toward a brazier 20 feet away where a single torch burns, orange and patient. That's when Marcus understands. This is not a trial. This is not an execution. This is theater. Welcome back. What you're about to hear isn't legend. It's not exaggeration from hostile chroniclers or Christian propagandists trying to demonize paganism. It's documented. Logged. Repeated. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome that survived 1,000 years after the West fell, maintained an arena culture that became so systematized, so refined in its cruelty, that even Roman historians in the West began referring to Constantinople's spectacles with a mixture of awe and disgust. But before we go further into the machine itself, before we pull back the curtain on how this system actually worked, take a second to leave a like on this video, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Seriously. I want to know if you're in Istanbul right now, walking past the ruins of the Hippodrome, or halfway across the world trying to make sense of how humans do this to each other. Your engagement keeps this channel going. Alright. Let's continue. Constantinople. 527 to 565 AD. The reign of Emperor Justinian I, often called the Great for his legal reforms, his reconquest of Italy and North Africa, his construction of the Hagia Sophia. A Christian emperor. A man who claimed to rule by divine mandate. And yet, under his watch, the Hippodrome, a massive arena holding up to 100,000 spectators, became the stage for spectacles that married Roman gladiatorial tradition with Byzantine bureaucratic precision and a dark, almost liturgical obsession with suffering as public pedagogy. The Byzantine Empire inherited Rome's infrastructure but refined its cruelty. Where Rome had gladiators and beast hunts, Byzantium developed damnatio ad bestias into a narrative art form. Criminals weren't just thrown to lions. They were cast into mythological tableaus, forced to play Prometheus, Icarus, Orpheus, and then killed in ways that mirrored the myths. A man condemned for arson might be burned alive while dressed as Hercules on a pyre. A thief might be bound to a wheel and broken, reenacting action's punishment. This wasn't random violence. It was coordinated. There were scriptwriters. Costume departments. Rehearsals. The Hippodrome had her administrative wing, the Officium Spectacularum, with clerks, engineers, animal handlers, and what we might today call execution designers. They kept records. They refined techniques. They innovated. Let's talk about one victim. Not a famous one. That's the point. His name appears in a single administrative document recovered from the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, a requisition order for materials dated April 537 AD. Marcus of Anch. Age 29. Literate. A merchant dealing in grain and olive oil. Arrested for blasphemy against the imperial cult, which in practice meant he drunkenly called a tax official a thief in a tavern full of witnesses. In Rome, this might have meant a fine or a public flogging. In Justinian's Constantinople, it meant the arena. Marcus spent 11 days in the Numera, the holding cells beneath the Hippodrome. Not in darkness. That's a misconception. The Byzantines understood that psychological preparation required visibility. The cells had narrow windows that looked directly onto the arena floor. For 11 days, Marcus watched rehearsals. He watched stagehands test trapdoors. He watched animals, bears, boars, dogs bred for size and aggression, being led through their paces. He watched other prisoners being measured, costumed, painted. On the third day, a clerk came to his cell. Not a guard, a clerk. Older man. Thin fingers stained with ink. He asked Marcus his height, his weight, whether he could swim, whether he had experience with fire. Marcus didn't understand the questions. The clerk noted his confusion and wrote, "Subject naive. Excellent for audience sympathy arc." This is the machine. The system wasn't designed to kill efficiently. It was designed to kill meaningfully. To transform a man into a lesson. The preparation was methodical. On day 7, Marcus was bathed. Not for hygiene, for the crowd's aesthetic expectations. Byzantines were obsessed with classical beauty even in death. His skin was oiled, his beard trimmed to fit the Hellenistic ideal of a tragic hero. He was fed honey cakes, watered wine, because a starved, weakened prisoner couldn't perform properly. Couldn't run. Couldn't scream with proper vigor. On day 9, they brought him a tunic. Expensive linen, dyed deep blue. The color of Prometheus in traditional stagings. Marcus, still clinging to hope that this was administrative error, that someone would realize he was just a merchant, asked the wardrobe attendant what was happening. The man, whose job title, according to payroll records, was vestita damnatorum, dresser of the condemned, replied, "You're the titan who stole fire. Tomorrow, you return it." That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He could hear the crowd already gathering outside. The Hippodrome events began at dawn, but people camped overnight for good seats. Vendors sold food, wine, betting tablets. There was laughter. Music. This wasn't a somber execution. It was a festival. At some point during that final night, a priest came. Not to offer salvation. The Byzantine Church had complicated theology around martyrdom versus lawful punishment, but to extract confession. Marcus confessed. Not to blasphemy, but to everything. Childhood thefts. Lustful thoughts. Disrespect toward his father. The priest listened, nodded, made notes. These confessions were sometimes read aloud before the execution as part of the narrative justification. The crowd loved it. It made the victim real. Relatable. Then punishable. Dawn. Marcus was led through the carceries, the tunnel system under the arena. The walls were covered in graffiti. Not from prisoners, from staff. Technical notes. Trap 3 sticks, needs oil. Lion from Numidia, aggressive, use pole. Marcus of Anch, fire act, approved by prefectus. His name. Already part of the infrastructure. They painted him with the chemical mixture. Later analysis of similar compounds used in Byzantine fire suggests a blend of petroleum distillates, sulfur, pine resin, and quicklime. It was designed to burn slowly. Very slowly. Not an explosion but a progression. The crowd needed time to react, to gasp, to pray, to cheer. He was chained to a wooden post at the center of the arena. Not tightly, he could move his arms, could gesture, could beg. The designers understood that immobility was boring. The chains were long enough to let him run in a small circle, about 8 feet in diameter. The psychological cruelty was exquisite. He could move, could try, but couldn't escape. The crowd roared as he was led out. 70,000 people. The sound was physical, a pressure against the chest. The editor, the game sponsor, in this case a senator named Belisarius, stood in the kathisma, the imperial box, and raised his hand. Silence fell like a curtain. A herald read the charges. Marcus of Anch. Blasphemy. Theft of imperial dignity through insult. The language was deliberately grand, transforming a tavern insult into cosmic treason. Then the herald read Marcus's confession, edited, amplified. Made him sound like a serial offender, a threat to social order. The crowd booed. This was participatory. They weren't just watching judgment, they were pronouncing it. Belisarius dropped a white cloth. The torchbearer approached. Here's what the sources describe, and here we tread carefully, because the accounts are both clinical and horrific. The initial ignition was at the feet. The chemical mixture didn't explode, it crept. Blue-green flames, almost liquid, climbing his legs. The quicklime component reacted with his sweat, creating additional heat. Marcus screamed, but the acoustics of the Hippodrome, designed for this, carried his voice to every tier. He ran in his small circle. The crowd watched the flames climb. Some cheered. Some, according to John of Ephesus, a contemporary chronicler, covered their children's eyes, though they didn't leave. That's important. The horror was expected. It was part of the experience, like tragic catharsis in Greek theater. The flames reached his torso after approximately 3 minutes. His movements became erratic, pain-destroying motor control. He fell. Rose. Fell again. The chemical mixture had been painted thickest on his back, so when he collapsed backward, the flames intensified. Eyewitnesses described the smell, not just burning flesh, but the chemical accelerants, reaching the upper tiers. 15 minutes. That's how long it took. Modern forensic analysis of similar burns suggests consciousness would have lasted perhaps 6 to 8 minutes before shock and oxygen deprivation caused mercy through unconsciousness. But the body continued to burn, continued to perform, for the full duration. When the flames finally died, attendants used long hooks to drag the remains off the sand. Efficiently. Quickly. Because the next act was waiting. A beast hunt. Then a chariot race. The day's programming was carefully timed. Marcus's ashes were dumped in a mass grave outside the city walls. No marker. No record beyond that single requisition order. But here's the aftermath that doesn't appear in the chronicles. The audience went home. They had dinner. They discussed the spectacle, the quality of the flames, the victims. Performance, whether the execution was well staged. There are dinner party records, social correspondence, where attendees critique arena events like we'd review movies. The Prometheus act on Thursday was disappointing, the victim died too quickly. The lion hunt last month was superior, better pacing. This wasn't sadism in the sense of individual pathology. It was cultural. Systemic. Children were brought to these events as educational experiences. See what happens to those who defy order. The message wasn't just punitive, it was pedagogical. The arena was a classroom where the curriculum was obedience written in agony. And the staff, the clerks, the costume designers, the torchbearers, they went home too. They had families. They were paid regular salaries. There are payroll documents. Pension records. One Vestita Damnatorum received a commendation for innovation in mythological staging. These weren't monsters. They were bureaucrats. That's the horror. Now let's talk about the pattern, because Marcus was not unique. The Hippodrome operated these spectacles approximately 40 to 60 times per year during Justinian's reign. A conservative estimate, based on crowd capacity, frequency, and documented victim counts, suggests somewhere between 2,000 to 5,000 individuals were executed this way during that 38-year period. Most were men, but not all. Women condemned for adultery, poisoning, or witchcraft were sometimes cast as Medea, Clytemnestra, or the Furies, and killed in thematically appropriate ways. There are administrative innovations documented in the archives. In 542 AD, an engineer named Anthemius, yes, the same Anthemius who helped design Hagia Sophia, developed an improved trapdoor system for damnatio ad bestias. Victims could be raised from below on platforms, creating surprise for the audience. He wrote about it clinically, mathematically, in a treatise on mechanical advantage and pulley systems. The church's response was complicated. Some bishops condemned the spectacles. Others remained silent. A few attended. The theological justification centered on Romans 13, governing authorities are established by God, and the idea that lawful punishment, however severe, was distinct from murder. This wasn't cruelty. It was justice. Televised. Theologized. Celebrated. There are moments in the historical record where you can see individual suffering break through the bureaucratic language. A letter from a mother to the Prefectus Urbi in 551 AD, begging for her son's sentence to be commuted to simple beheading rather than arena execution. The request was denied, not out of cruelty, but because his crime, theft from a church, demanded public pedagogical resolution. Another document, an expense report for chemical supplies for fire executions, April-June 558. Listed like office supplies. Alongside costs for animal feed, sand replacement, and torch maintenance. And then there are the silences. The gaps in family records where a name simply stops appearing. No death notice. No burial record. Just absence. Because arena victims weren't given the honor of documentation. They became part of the spectacle's logistics, not its history. There's a Byzantine bureaucratic term, homo oblatus ad ludum, man offered to the games. Offered. Like a sacrifice. Like a sacrament. The language reveals everything about how the system understood itself, not as punishment, but as ritual. The Hippodrome's execution spectacles declined after Justinian's death, not for moral reasons but for economic ones. The reconquest campaigns had been expensive. Maintaining the game's elaborate infrastructure, the animals, the engineers, the staff, became cost-prohibitive. By the 7th century, simpler execution methods, beheading, hanging, became standard. Efficient. Cheap. Boring. But the building remained. The Hippodrome still stands in Istanbul today, at least, its skeleton does. The Sultanahmet Square. Tourists walk across ground where Marcus burned. Where thousands burned, drowned, were torn apart, crushed, all while crowds cheered and vendors sold honey cakes. There's no memorial. No plaque listing names. Because there are no names. Just that handful of administrative documents scattered across archives, requisition orders, and payroll records that treat human death as a line item. Here's the question that should haunt us: how many Marcuses are there? How many individuals, unremarkable except for their suffering, were fed into systems so normalized that their deaths warranted less documentation than the purchase of rope and oil? We know about the Hippodrome because of its scale, its grandeur, because Byzantine bureaucracy was obsessive about record-keeping. But smaller arenas existed throughout the empire. Provincial governors held their own games. Town magistrates staged local executions. The records for those, if they ever existed, are gone. Papyrus doesn't survive 1,000 years of neglect. And that's just Byzantium. This isn't a documentary about one uniquely evil empire. It's a case study in what happens when cruelty becomes infrastructure. When violence becomes so procedural, so embedded in civic life, that people stop seeing it as violence at all. Just order. Justice. Entertainment. The Romans did it. The Byzantines refined it. The question we should ask isn't how could they? Because we know how. Bureaucracy. Ritual. Incrementalism. The slow transformation of human beings into props, into lessons, into line items. The question is, where is it happening now? What we've covered today is one strand in a vast, horrific tapestry of institutionalized cruelty that defined Byzantine arena culture. But there are others. The Suppresio in Aqua, drowning executions staged as mythological drownings, with victims dressed as Narcissus or Hylas, weights attached, thrown into flooded arena floors while crowds watched them sink. The damnatio ad flammas, not just fire, but theatrical fire, with